Welcome back to another spine-chilling episode where we dive deep into the most terrifying true stories that will make you question whether you'll ever feel safe in a hotel again. Today we're exploring three absolutely bone-chilling encounters that happened to real people in real hotels, and trust me, these stories will have you sleeping with one eye open the next time you're away from home. Now, before we jump into these nightmare fuel experiences, let me just say that these aren't your typical ghost stories or urban legends. These are verified accounts from people who lived through some of the most horrifying nights of their lives. And what makes them even more disturbing is that they could happen to absolutely anyone. So if you're easily spooked, you might want to grab a friend or turn on some extra lights, because we're about to dive into some seriously dark territory. Our first story comes from a business traveler named Marcus, who was staying at what seemed like a perfectly normal mid-range hotel in Ohio. It was supposed to be a routine overnight stay, nothing fancy, just a clean room and a decent night's sleep before his morning meeting. But what started as an ordinary Tuesday night turned into an experience that would haunt him for years to come. Marcus checked into room 237 around 9 p.m. The hotel seemed quiet enough, maybe half full, with most guests already settled in for the evening. He grabbed his key card, took the elevator to the second floor, and made his way down the dimly lit hallway. The carpet was that generic hotel pattern you've seen 1,000 times, and the walls were painted that neutral beige color that screams corporate accommodation. After settling into his room, Marcus ordered some room service, caught up on emails, and decided to call it an early night. He was exhausted from travel and had an important presentation the next morning. But around 2 a.m. he was jolted awake by what sounded like someone walking back and forth in the hallway outside his room. At first he figured it was just another guest having trouble sleeping, or maybe hotel staff doing their rounds. But the footsteps continued for what felt like hours. They weren't random either. They were deliberate, measured, like someone pacing the exact same path over and over again. The sound would start at one end of the hallway, walk slowly to the other end, pause for about 30 seconds, then repeat. Marcus tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, but something about the rhythm was deeply unsettling. It was too precise, too methodical. After about an hour of this, curiosity got the better of him. He crept over to the door and looked through the peephole. What he saw made his blood run cold. There was a man in the hallway, but something was very wrong with him. The figure was wearing what looked like an old-fashioned hotel uniform, the kind you might see in a vintage photograph from the 1950s. But his movements were jerky and unnatural, like he was fighting against invisible restraints with every step. The man would walk to one end of the hallway, stop at room 241, and stand there for exactly 30 seconds staring at the door. Then he would turn around and walk to the other end, stop at room 229, and repeat the same process. His face was completely expressionless, almost mask-like, and his eyes never blinked. Marcus watched this bizarre ritual for nearly 20 minutes, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to call the front desk, but something told him to stay quiet and just observe. That's when things got infinitely worse. The man in the uniform suddenly stopped his pacing routine and turned to look directly at Marcus's door. Even through the peephole, Marcus could swear the figure was looking right at him. The man's mouth opened into what looked like a silent scream, and he began walking straight toward room 237. Marcus backed away from the door, his hands shaking as he reached for his phone. But before he could dial, the footsteps stopped right outside his room. The silence was deafening. Marcus held his breath, afraid to make even the slightest sound. Then came the knocking. But it wasn't normal knocking. It was a pattern. 3 quick knocks, pause, 3 more knocks, pause, then 3 final knocks. After each set of 9 knocks, there would be complete silence for exactly 1 minute. Then the pattern would start again. This continued for over an hour. Marcus was too terrified to look through the peephole again, too scared to call the front desk, too paralyzed to do anything but sit on his bed and listen to that methodical, relentless knocking. When morning finally came, the knocking stopped. Marcus waited until he heard other guests moving around in the hallway before he worked up the courage to open his door. The hallway was completely normal, bright, clean, with a few guests heading to the elevator for breakfast. At checkout, Marcus casually asked the front desk clerk about any overnight disturbances. The young woman looked puzzled and assured him that they hadn't received any noise complaints. When he pressed further and asked about the hotel's history, her expression changed completely. She glanced around nervously before leaning in close and whispering that room 237 had a reputation among the staff. Apparently, multiple guests over the years had reported similar experiences. Always the same man in the vintage uniform, always the same pacing pattern, always the same methodical knocking. The truly chilling part? The hotel had been renovated 3 times since the 1950s, and according to the records, there had never been an employee who matched that description. But guests kept seeing him year after year, always following the exact same routine. Marcus never found out who or what he encountered that night, but he made sure to never stay in room 237 again. In fact, he made sure to never stay in that hotel again, period. Our second story takes us to a supposedly haunted bed and breakfast in New England, where a young couple named Sarah and David decided to spend their anniversary weekend. They'd booked the Victorian-era Inn specifically because of its reputation for paranormal activity, thinking it would be a fun, spooky adventure to share together. The Blackwood Inn was everything they'd hoped for. Antique furniture, creaky floors, dim lighting, and an atmosphere thick with history. Their room was on the 3rd floor, decorated with period pieces and featuring a massive 4-poster bed that the innkeeper claimed dated back to the 1800s. The first night passed without incident. They enjoyed a romantic dinner, explored the inn's common areas, and even participated in the ghost tour that the innkeeper offered for guests. It was all very atmospheric and entertaining, exactly what they'd wanted for their getaway. But the second night, things took a terrifying turn. Sarah woke up around 3 a.m. to find David sitting bolt upright in bed, staring at the corner of the room. His eyes were wide open, but when she called his name, he didn't respond. He was completely motionless, like a statue. Sarah followed his gaze to the corner of the room, and what she saw there made her stomach drop. There was a woman standing in the shadows wearing a long white nightgown that seemed to shimmer in the darkness. The woman's hair was long and black, hanging down to cover most of her face, but Sarah could see her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The woman began to move toward the bed, her feet never quite touching the floor. She seemed to glide across the room, her movements fluid and otherworldly. As she got closer, Sarah could see that her face was pale as porcelain, with dark circles under her eyes and lips that were almost black. Sarah tried to wake David, shaking him and whispering his name urgently, but he remained frozen in place. The woman continued her approach, and Sarah realized she was heading specifically for David's side of the bed. When she was just a few feet away, the woman extended her hand toward David's face. That's when Sarah found her voice and screamed. The sound echoed through the room, and suddenly David snapped out of his trance-like state. He looked around confused, asking what was wrong, but the woman had vanished completely. Sarah was shaking as she told David what she'd seen, but he had no memory of any of it. He claimed he'd been sleeping soundly and hadn't seen anything unusual, but Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. There were scratches on David's cheek, 3 parallel lines that definitely hadn't been there when they went to bed. They decided to check out immediately, even though it was still the middle of the night. As they packed their bags, Sarah kept glancing at the corner where the woman had appeared, half expecting to see her again. The scratches on David's face were getting deeper and more pronounced, almost like they were still being carved by invisible fingernails. When they went to the front desk to check out, the night clerk took one look at David's face and went pale. Without saying a word, he pulled out a thick leather journal and flipped through several pages before stopping at an entry that made Sarah's heart skip a beat. The journal contained reports from other guests who'd stayed in their room over the years. Story after story of a woman in white who appeared to men while they slept, always leaving the same 3 scratch marks on their faces. According to the entries, she was believed to be the spirit of a woman who had died in that room in 1847, murdered by her husband in a fit of jealous rage. The most disturbing part of the journal was the final entry, dated just 2 months earlier. A guest had written about seeing the woman in white, but this time she hadn't just scratched him. She had whispered something in his ear while he was in that trance-like state. The guest claimed she had told him to join her forever and that he'd felt an overwhelming urge to throw himself from the 3rd-floor window. Sarah and David left the inn immediately and never spoke about the experience again. But David still bears those scars on his face, 3 perfectly parallel lines that serve as a permanent reminder of their encounter with whatever haunts room 12 at the Blackwood Inn. Our final story comes from a luxury resort in the mountains of Colorado, where a family of 4 thought they were getting away for a perfect winter vacation. The Andersons had booked a week-long stay at the Snow Peak Resort, a 5-star property that promised world-class skiing, gourmet dining, and complete relaxation. The family consisted of parents Mike and Jennifer, along with their 2 children, Emma, who was 12, and Jason, who was 8. They'd been looking forward to this trip for months, and everything seemed perfect when they arrived. The resort was stunning. Their suite was spacious and elegant, and the staff was incredibly attentive. But on their 3rd night, young Emma woke up screaming. Mike looked out the window but saw nothing except the snowy landscape and the ski slopes in the distance. Emma insisted that she'd seen a group of children standing in the snow, all wearing old-fashioned winter clothing. She said they were waving at her and trying to get her to come outside. Jennifer assumed it was just a nightmare and managed to calm Emma down, but the little girl refused to sleep in her own room for the rest of the night. The next morning, Emma was still shaken by whatever she'd seen. She kept asking her parents about the children in the snow, describing them in vivid detail. According to Emma, there were 5 of them, all around her age, wearing heavy coats and boots that looked like they were from a different time period. She said their faces were blue from the cold and their eyes were completely black. Mike and Jennifer thought it was just an overactive imagination combined with the stress of being in a new place. But that night, Jason woke up with the same story. He'd seen the children too, and they were closer to the window this time, pressing their faces against the glass and mouthing words he couldn't understand. This time, Mike took the children's claims more seriously. He went to the front desk and asked about the history of the resort. The desk clerk seemed uncomfortable with the question, but eventually revealed that the luxury resort had been built on the site of an old boarding school that had burned down in 1923. The fire had been a tragedy that made national news at the time. 5 children had died in the blaze, trapped in a dormitory on the upper floor. They'd been found near the windows, apparently trying to escape through the glass. The bodies had been discovered with their faces pressed against the windows, their hands clawing at the glass in a desperate attempt to break free. Mike felt sick as he listened to this story, but it got worse. The clerk mentioned that other families with children had reported similar experiences over the years. The sightings always involved the same 5 children, always appearing outside the windows of rooms on the 3rd floor, always trying to communicate with the living children inside. That night, Mike set up a camera pointed at the window in Emma's room. He was determined to either debunk his children's claims or capture evidence of what they were seeing. Around 2 a.m., the camera detected movement outside the window. When Mike reviewed the footage the next morning, his hands were shaking as he watched. The camera had clearly captured 5 small figures standing in the snow outside the window. They were exactly as Emma had described them, wearing old-fashioned winter clothes and staring directly at the camera with those black, empty eyes. But the most disturbing part of the footage was what happened next. The children began to move toward the window, their movements jerky and unnatural. As they got closer, Mike could see that their faces were indeed blue from the cold and their mouths were moving as if they were speaking, but no sound came through the glass. Then one of the children, a little girl who looked about Emma's age, placed her hand on the window. The glass began to frost over in the shape of her palm, and letters started appearing in the frost. Mike had to watch the footage several times before he could make out what it said. "Help us." The Anderson family checked out that very morning, cutting their vacation short and never returning to the Snow Peak Resort. But Mike kept the footage, and sometimes late at night he watches it again, wondering if those children are still out there in the snow, still trying to escape a fire that happened nearly a century ago. These 3 stories remind us that sometimes the most terrifying experiences happen in the places where we're supposed to feel safe and comfortable. Hotels, inns, and resorts are meant to be temporary homes away from home. but sometimes they become the setting for encounters that will haunt us forever. The next time you're staying somewhere unfamiliar, remember these stories. Pay attention to the sounds in the hallway. Check the corners of your room before you go to sleep. And if you see something that doesn't seem quite right, trust your instincts. Sometimes the most horrifying experiences are the ones that happen to ordinary people in ordinary places, and the only thing standing between a peaceful night's sleep and a living nightmare is pure chance. Thanks for joining me for another dive into the darkest corners of human experience. If you enjoyed these spine-tingling true stories, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because we've got plenty more terrifying tales coming your way. And remember, these stories are all too real, which makes them infinitely more frightening than any work of fiction could ever be.